I can't believe I let myself get here again, I muttered to myself, disbelief washing over me. My name is Eve Montgomery, and the last thing you'd expect is for someone like me to be standing here, at the crossroads of ruining everything again. But trust me, this story, it's not about what you think, it's about what I'm about to show you. You'll want to keep watching. I sat at my desk, the glow of the computer screen casting a cold light on my face, but I couldn't focus. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, too heavy to type, my mind racing, tangled in a mess of thoughts. The office was unnervingly quiet, the hum of the air conditioning a constant, almost mocking presence in the background. I knew something was about to change, something I couldn't avoid anymore. Victoria King, our new CEO, was making her rounds today, as she always did. A sharp, confident figure, with the air of someone who had worked her way to the top, and would stop at nothing to stay there. My former colleagues, the ones who used to laugh and joke in the break room, had become mere shadows of themselves. Fear was everywhere in the office, thinly veiled by the forced smiles and hushed tones. I could feel it too, deep in my chest, tighter with each passing day. The door to my cubicle opened without warning, and there she was, Victoria, striding across the floor with her signature heels clicking sharply against the tile. Her eyes didn't even flicker toward me at first, but then, as if she'd decided it was time, she paused. "You're dead weight," she said, her voice carrying across the open space. The words felt like daggers, sharp and precise. I could feel the eyes of my coworkers burning into me, though I refused to let them rattle me. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction. "We're cutting costs," she continued, looking down at me like I was a nuisance she had to deal with. "And frankly, your position is unnecessary." I remained still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my back straight. I wasn't going to beg, I wasn't going to give her what she expected. But the sting of her words still lingered. It wasn't just the dismissal, it was the public humiliation. 3 years of dedication, of sacrificing personal time, of building a future in this company, and it was all reduced to this one sweeping statement that erased everything. She went on, outlining all the reasons why I didn't belong here anymore. "You barely contribute in meetings, you question processes that have worked for years, your reports are consistently late." Each accusation hit like a punch to the gut, but I held my composure. None of it was true, but I kept my mouth shut. I knew the truth, and that was all that mattered. "You have until the end of the day to clear out your desk," she finished coldly. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. But I wasn't about to show her my panic. Victoria didn't even look back as she turned on her heel, her footsteps echoing in the silent office. The room remained frozen, as if no one dared to move until she was gone. I could feel the weight of their stares, but I refused to acknowledge them. Instead, I focused on the one thing that anchored me in this moment. The knowledge that I was more than this office. More than Victoria's cruel words. I wasn't just a disgruntled employee, though she'd likely made me out to be one. I was Eve Montgomery, and this was my company. And though they didn't know it, I controlled 87% of Montgomery Pharmaceuticals. It had been 3 years since I stepped down from my role as the public face of the company after my father passed away. I'd left the helm to someone else, someone with fresh ideas, someone the board thought could bring new energy. But what they didn't know was that I had no intention of stepping away for good. Instead, I'd carefully crafted a new identity. Eve Daniels, an employee just like everyone else. No one knew who I was. I'd hidden in plain sight, working in research analytics, watching, learning. No one had suspected a thing. The company had always been a family business to me, my grandfather's legacy, my father's pride, and now mine to protect. When my father passed, the board was eager to fill the CEO position quickly, and they brought in Victoria, whose credentials were impeccable. Stanford MBA, years of leadership experience in the healthcare industry, she seemed perfect on paper. But I didn't trust her from the start. Her charm was too polished, her ambition too calculated. But I let her have the job, hoping she would honor the values my family had built this company on: integrity, innovation, and above all, patient care. At first, things seemed to go well. Profits rose, expansion was on the horizon, and the company was moving into new therapeutic areas. But slowly, I began to see cracks in the foundation. Research budgets were cut, talented employees replaced by contractors, Quality control became a buzzword rather than a practice. And the atmosphere? Fear. Fear of speaking up. Fear of disagreeing with Victoria's vision. I watched it all, documented it all. But I stayed silent, pretending to be just another cog in the machine. I had planned to stay undercover for another 6 months, gathering more evidence, preparing a plan to reclaim my company. But when Victoria humiliated me in front of the entire office today, my timeline accelerated. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had no choice now but to act. As I packed up my desk, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. Anxiety, sure, but also something else. A sense of relief, even pride. I'd seen enough. I'd gathered the proof I needed. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about saving Montgomery Pharmaceuticals from becoming just another casualty of short-term greed. I glanced up from my desk, noticing Alan from the legal department watching me from across the room. His face was etched with concern, his brow furrowed as he slowly approached. "Everything all right?" he asked in a low voice, glancing toward Victoria's office. "She's making bigger moves than you know." I shook my head, forcing a smile. "It will be," I said quietly, though doubt crept in at the edges of my words. Alan had been with Montgomery longer than I had. He knew the company inside and out, and he was one of the few who knew my true identity. He leaned closer, lowering his voice further. "The termination list for tomorrow's meeting, it's extensive. Entire departments." The weight of his words settled over me like a cold fog. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was bigger than I had anticipated. Victoria wasn't just dismantling the company's culture, she was tearing apart everything that made Montgomery special. But I couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not now. Not when I was so close to reclaiming what was rightfully mine. As I finished packing my things, I couldn't help but ask myself, what will happen now? It wasn't just about surviving this battle. It was about saving the company and its legacy before it was too late. Tomorrow was the shareholder meeting, and it was no longer going to be a simple quarterly update. It was going to be my chance to take back control. As I walked out of the office, the weight of Victoria's words still echoed in my mind. Dead weight. The phrase replayed over and over, gnawing at me, a stark reminder of how she saw me, how she saw all of us. The stares of my coworkers lingered in the back of my mind as well. Some with pity, others with quiet curiosity, as though waiting for me to crack. But I didn't. I couldn't. I had spent years, 3 years, hidden within the very company I had built, watching it slip into the hands of someone who didn't care about its soul. Someone who saw only numbers and profits. Someone who didn't understand what Montgomery Pharmaceuticals stood for. And now, that someone had fired me in front of the entire office. But what hurt more than the loss of my position was the realization that I had failed in protecting the company I loved. I made my way down the stairs, the sleek marble floors beneath my feet cold and impersonal. My mind was a storm, emotions clashing in waves. There was the sting of anger, sharp and bitter, against Victoria's betrayal. Then came the frustration, a low, simmering heat. How had it come to this? I had worked so hard, carefully watching, gathering evidence, and yet, in the end, it wasn't enough. It was all slipping through my fingers. And with that thought, a sense of fear gripped me, but it wasn't the kind of fear that paralyzed, it was the kind that fueled action, the kind that made you move when there seemed to be no way forward. But deeper than all of this, there was something else. Something I hadn't expected. A sense of freedom. The chains that had held me, whether from my role as an anonymous employee or my loyalty to the company, were breaking. I had been pushed into a corner, yes, but in doing so, I finally had the power to act. What am I waiting for? I asked myself as I stood outside, the cold Chicago wind biting at my skin. I hadn't planned to act this soon. My original plan had been for 6 more months of gathering, analyzing, preparing for the inevitable showdown. But now everything had changed. The humiliation, the secrecy, the lies. It had pushed me to this point faster than I could have imagined. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't just angry with Victoria, I was angry with myself for letting it go on for so long. I shook my head, trying to rid myself of the self-doubt. I did what I had to do, I reminded myself. I had to see it all firsthand to understand exactly how far Victoria had gone. But now it was personal. It was not just about saving Montgomery's legacy anymore. It was about redemption. about righting the wrongs I had allowed to happen under my nose. I can't let her destroy this company, I thought, my chest tightening at the realization. The thought of how far she would go to erase everything my family had built sickened me. The research division, the heart of Montgomery, was being dismantled piece by piece. Jobs were being outsourced, quality control reduced to nothing, all for the sake of a merger that wasn't even finalized. The company was crumbling, and in her mind, I was the last obstacle standing between her and the top. But as much as I wanted to act out of anger and frustration, I knew I couldn't. There was a line I wouldn't cross, no matter how justified I felt. I wouldn't destroy Victoria, not in the way she might think. I wasn't here to ruin her. I was here to save Montgomery, and in doing so, I would restore what had been lost. But was that enough? Could I really take back control of the company without completely disrupting everything? Could I dismantle the power structure Victoria had so carefully built, without tearing apart the fabric of what Montgomery had always stood for? These were the questions that lingered in my mind as I reached my apartment. I had always prided myself on being methodical, careful, and patient. But now I felt a deep urgency that I hadn't felt in years. The next steps couldn't be taken lightly. I had a plan, but it was just that, a plan. And plans could fail. What if I'm too late? The thought crept in, and I immediately pushed it back down. I had no time for fear. As I sat down at my desk, the evening shadows creeping over my apartment, I looked at the papers I had prepared. Tomorrow was the shareholder meeting, and I had to be ready. I had to expose everything. Victoria's lies, the merger, the illegal dealings, the destroyed careers, everything. But most importantly, I had to remind the board of something they had forgotten. What made Montgomery special? The phone buzzed on the table, pulling me from my thoughts. It was Alan. His message was simple, but it sent a chill down my spine. Meeting moved up to 10 a.m. tomorrow. Victoria presenting new strategy to the board. Be ready. I closed my eyes for a moment, collecting myself. Tomorrow. That was it. The moment of truth. My hand hovered over my phone for a second, and then I typed a message back. Thank you. I'll be there. The response was quick, just a simple, "We'll do it right this time." I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair. What have I really learned from all of this? The question echoed in my mind. The company I had loved and built had become a shell of itself, consumed by greed and ambition. But I had learned something about myself as well. I had learned that I could endure, that I could fight when I had to. Tomorrow, everything would change. I could feel it in my bones. That strange mixture of anticipation and dread, of fear and hope. I had a mission. I had a purpose. The plan was set in motion, and there was no turning back now. I stood up, walking to the window, looking out over the city, the bright lights blinking in the distance. I'm ready, I thought. I have to be. And with that, the decision was made. Tomorrow, Victoria King's reign would end, not with a bang, but with a vote that would change everything. I was ready to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The battle had just begun. The morning light filtered softly through the blinds of my apartment as I stared at the clock on my desk, watching the seconds tick by. It was almost time. The tension in my chest was like a constant weight, but beneath it, there was something else, an undeniable sense of purpose. I had been preparing for this day for years, gathering evidence, watching from the sidelines, and now the moment had arrived. It was no longer about remaining in the shadows, it was time to step into the light and take control. I had spent the night going over every document, every report, every piece of evidence I had meticulously gathered during my years at Montgomery. Each file, each spreadsheet, each memo was a piece of the puzzle I needed to present to the board. They needed to understand what Victoria had done, how she had manipulated the company's finances, decimated its values, and put its legacy at risk. I was no longer just Eve Montgomery, the woman who had stepped down and let someone else take the reins. Today, I was Eve Montgomery, the woman who would reclaim everything. As I dressed in the sharp suit I hadn't worn in years, I couldn't help but feel a surge of mixed emotions. There was a cold certainty in the way the fabric hugged my body, a reminder that I had to be confident, strong, and assertive. But beneath that, a small part of me still questioned whether I was doing the right thing. I had spent so much of my life in the shadows, stepping aside for the good of the company, trusting that someone else would continue the work my family had started. But now I was questioning everything I had done. What if I'm wrong? The thought crept into my mind. What if I'm just another power-hungry CEO trying to take back something that's better left in the past? I shook my head, pushing the doubt away. No, this is what has to happen. The company has to survive. I can't let Victoria destroy everything my father and grandfather built. The meeting was at 10 a.m., and I knew the board would be expecting Victoria's usual charm, her polished confidence, her ability to make any bad decision sound like a stroke of genius. But today would be different. Today I was the one who would speak with clarity and conviction, not her. I had the facts, I had the proof, and most importantly, I had the truth on my side. As I arrived at the building, I could already feel the difference in the air. The cold, sterile lobby, once a place of quiet efficiency, now seemed like a battlefield. The security guards nodded as I passed, but there was no recognition in their eyes. No one knew who I really was, not anymore. But I didn't need them to. I didn't need anyone's recognition. Not today. I swiped the keycard that I hadn't used in years, the familiar beep of the elevator reminding me of how far I'd come. When I stepped into the executive elevator, my heart beat a little faster. I had spent years climbing this corporate ladder, always from behind the scenes. But now, I wasn't just a silent observer. Now, I was the one who would take control. As the elevator ascended, I thought back to the early days of Montgomery Pharmaceuticals. I remembered my father's voice, his proud smile when he talked about how the company was founded. It wasn't just about making money, it was about helping people. It was about creating affordable medications that could change lives. And somehow that mission had been lost along the way. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and I stepped into the boardroom. There was a moment of stunned silence as 14 sets of eyes turned toward me, their expressions ranging from confusion to shock. Victoria was sitting at the head of the table, her face freezing as she recognized me. The air in the room thickened, but I didn't falter. I walked in slowly, setting my briefcase down on the table, my movements deliberate and calm. "Eve?" Harold Jensen, the longest-serving member of the board, asked, his voice full of disbelief. "Is that you?" I nodded, keeping my voice steady. "Yes, Harold, it's me." Victoria's hand instinctively reached for the phone, probably ready to call security, but she didn't get the chance. I held up a hand, signaling her to stop. "I don't think that will be necessary," I said, my voice clear and confident as I addressed the room. "This meeting was supposed to be about your vision for the future of Montgomery Pharmaceuticals. But what you don't understand, Victoria, is that the future you've envisioned has already destroyed the foundation of this company." I could see the tension in the room, the board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats, the air heavy with anticipation. They had never seen me like this before. To them, I had been a quiet observer, a shadow on the sidelines. But today, I was the one who would lead. Victoria recovered quickly, though, her usual air of superiority creeping back. "This is highly irregular," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "Miss Montgomery, this is a private meeting and you have no right to be here." I leaned forward, placing a file in front of each board member. "Actually, I do. Because I'm still the majority shareholder of Montgomery Pharmaceuticals, and I have the right to know exactly what's been happening in my company." There was a collective pause as the board members began to scan the documents in front of them. Victoria's expression darkened as she recognized the file, the very one that Alan had accidentally sent to me the previous day. "This is a misunderstanding," Victoria said quickly, her voice now defensive. "These documents were meant to be confidential, preliminary drafts. Nothing has been finalized." I shook my head. "You can call it a misunderstanding all you want, but the truth is, in these pages, Victoria, you've been systematically undermining Montgomery's values, cutting corners on quality, firing employees who speak out. You've even gone as far as negotiating a merger with Axiom Pharmaceuticals without the board's approval." Her eyes widened in shock. "That's not true," she protested, but I could see the fear creeping into her voice. She knew she had been caught. I didn't give her the chance to continue. I pulled up my tablet and connected it to the boardroom's display system. The screen filled with a detailed timeline of the changes she had implemented under her leadership. Research budget cuts disguised as efficiency measures, quality control reductions hidden in technical jargon, and terminated employees who had raised legitimate concerns about safety and quality. The data didn't lie. I've been working here for 3 years, observing, documenting, I said, my voice steady. And what I've learned is that this company has lost its way. You've compromised everything that Montgomery Pharmaceuticals was built on, and you've done it all for your own personal gain. Victoria's face flushed with anger, but I could see that she was starting to unravel. The board members were no longer looking at her with admiration, they were looking at her with doubt. And I knew that doubt was the beginning of the end for her. I paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. This is it. The first step in taking back control. Tomorrow it wouldn't just be about the shareholders' meeting, it would be about the future of Montgomery Pharmaceuticals, and about proving that integrity still mattered. That we could grow, but only if we stayed true to who we were. I wasn't going to let anyone, especially Victoria, tear that down. The silence in the boardroom was deafening. The faces of the board members, once so sure of themselves, now looked unsettled. I watched their eyes as they scanned the documents in front of them, my evidence laid bare for all to see. This wasn't just a corporate issue anymore, it was a moral one. And in the quiet that followed, I could see the internal struggle playing out on their faces. Some looked at Victoria with doubt, while others, the ones she had carefully placed in positions of power, still stood by her. But there was no denying that the tide was shifting. Victoria, despite her usual composure, was visibly rattled. She sat there, her fingers nervously tapping against the edge of the table. It was almost like watching her attempt to hold on to the last shred of her confidence, but the cracks were already showing. Her earlier bravado had vanished, replaced with a frantic energy as she tried to regain control. "This is all speculative," she finally said, her voice more tense than it had been before. "You're misunderstanding the situation. We've been trying to grow the company, increase profitability. What we're doing is necessary to stay competitive in a rapidly changing market." I couldn't help but shake my head. The same arguments she had used for years, the ones that had sounded so plausible in board meetings, were now hollow to me. I had seen the consequences of her decisions, the lives disrupted, the colleagues pushed out. I knew better. This wasn't about growth. It was about power, control, and lining her own pockets at the expense of everything Montgomery had ever stood for. "No, Victoria," I said, my voice cutting through her words, firm and unwavering. "What you're doing is destroying the very thing this company was founded on. Montgomery Pharmaceuticals was never about being the biggest player in the game. It was about doing the right thing, about creating something that actually helps people. You've turned it into a commodity, something to be bought and sold." Her face flushed, a mixture of anger and disbelief. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of the board. And yet, here I was, her worst nightmare, the one person who knew the truth and was willing to expose it. "You have no idea what it takes to run a company," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "This isn't some family business that you can coddle along. We're in a global market now, and if we don't evolve, we'll be left behind." "I know exactly what it takes to run this company," I countered, leaning forward, my eyes locked on hers. "And it takes more than just cutting costs and firing people to stay competitive. It takes integrity. It takes values. That's the foundation Montgomery was built on. You've sacrificed all of that." I felt the weight of every word, the force of everything I had worked for, all the years spent building this company with my father, coming to a head. This wasn't just a business decision. It was personal. It was about the legacy of my family, about everything we had created, and everything Victoria was about to destroy. "Enough, Eve," Victoria said, her voice trembling slightly. "You're overreacting. You're not thinking clearly." But I wasn't overreacting. I had seen what her vision had done to Montgomery. The research division, once the heart of the company, was being gutted. The talented scientists and employees who had poured their blood, sweat, and tears into the work were being replaced with cheaper labor, outsourced to places where the standards were lower, where quality control didn't matter. The patients who relied on our medications were being put at risk. All for what? A merger? A quick profit? I felt the anger bubbling up inside of me, a sharp, hot surge that threatened to spill over. But I knew better than to let it control me. "Keep your composure," I reminded myself. Stay focused on what matters. I reached for another folder and slid it across the table toward Victoria. The room was silent, all eyes on her as she slowly opened it. It was the final piece of the puzzle. The financial analysis. I had spent weeks preparing it, detailing the long-term risks of her decisions, the potential fallout of the merger, and the damage it would do to our reputation. I could see her stiffen as she read through the numbers, the weight of the reality of what she had done hitting her. She had always been able to justify her decisions with short-term gains, but now, the long-term consequences were staring her in the face. "This is absurd," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "You can't be serious." "I'm very serious," I said. "This is about the future of Montgomery, and if you continue on this path, there won't be a future. You've compromised everything we stand for." I let those words hang in the air for a moment before I stood up. The boardroom was tense, the silence stretching longer than I expected. I glanced at Harold, the longest-serving member of the board, hoping he would speak up. He had always been a steady presence at Montgomery, and I needed him now more than ever. He cleared his throat, finally breaking the silence. "Eve," Harold said, his voice calm but firm, "you've made your case. But we need to take time to review all of this properly. We can't make such a monumental decision without thorough consideration." I nodded, understanding the weight of what was at stake. "I agree, Harold. But the truth is, you don't need more time to see the damage that's been done. The evidence is right in front of you. Victoria has already made her moves, and those moves have already begun to hurt this company." Victoria's face darkened, but she didn't say anything. She was no longer the confident leader she had been when I first stepped into this room. She was exposed, vulnerable in a way I had never seen her before. "Then I call for a vote," I said, my voice steady. "A vote of no confidence in Victoria King's leadership." Her eyes flashed with fury. "You can't do that. The board hired me. You have no right." "I have every right," I interrupted, my voice growing firmer. "As the majority shareholder, I have the right to demand a vote. And I intend to use that right today." There was a moment of hesitation in the room. I could see the board members exchanging glances, weighing their options. But deep down I knew they could feel it too, the shift in the air, the truth that had been revealed. They had to choose between loyalty to the company's legacy and loyalty to a CEO who had sold that legacy for short-term gain. I stood there, waiting for the inevitable. The tension was thick, but I knew that this was the turning point. It wasn't just about removing Victoria. It was about restoring the heart of Montgomery, about reminding everyone what we had stood for all these years. The vote was coming, and for the first time in years, I felt a surge of hope. The silence in the boardroom felt suffocating. The weight of the decision that lay ahead was palpable, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow down. My heart pounded in my chest, but I kept my composure. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about removing a CEO, it was about reclaiming the soul of Montgomery Pharmaceuticals, about saving the company from an irreversible course. Victoria's face had drained of color, but she wasn't backing down. Her eyes were locked onto mine, a storm of frustration and disbelief swirling in them. For the first time since I had entered the room, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. She was no longer the untouchable figure she had once been. She was a woman who realized she was on the verge of losing everything. "I demand that we adjourn this meeting," Victoria said, her voice shaky but loud, desperate. "You can't do this, Eve. You're acting on incomplete information, based on personal grievances. This isn't just about you being upset, this is about the future of the company." But I wasn't upset. I wasn't here to throw a tantrum or act out of anger. I was here because I cared. I cared about Montgomery. I cared about its people. And above all, I cared about its legacy. The legacy my family had built over decades, and that Victoria had nearly destroyed in just a few years. "I'm not acting out of personal grievances, Victoria," I said, my voice steady. "I'm acting because I've seen the damage you've done. I've seen the lives you've ruined, the quality you've compromised, and the future you've sold out for short-term profits. This company deserves better. The people here deserve better." I glanced around the table, meeting the eyes of the board members. Some looked uneasy, others appeared conflicted, but none of them seemed as convinced as they had been before Victoria's presentation. The truth was starting to settle in. I could feel the shift in the room, the collective realization that what I was saying wasn't just an emotional reaction, it was a matter of fact. I took a deep breath and continued. You've turned Montgomery Pharmaceuticals into something unrecognizable. You've sacrificed our core values for your own personal gain. And now, you're trying to push through a merger with Axiom Pharmaceuticals, a deal that benefits no one but yourself. I can't let that happen. I won't let that happen. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room seemed frozen, the weight of my words settling into the board members like a heavy fog. I knew it was time. I had made my case, and it was clear to everyone in the room that there was only one course of action left. Harold, I need you to call for the vote, I said, my voice calm but resolute. I turned to him, my eyes steady. I wasn't asking anymore, I was demanding it. You've seen the documents, you know what's at stake here. The time for indecision is over. Harold cleared his throat, his face lined with concern, but there was a glimmer of recognition in his eyes. He had always been a man of principle. He knew what Montgomery stood for, and now he could see what had happened to it under Victoria's leadership. You're right, he said, his voice steady. This can't wait. It's time for a vote. The room seemed to hold its breath as Harold turned to the board members, his voice firm. All in favor of a vote of no confidence in CEO Victoria King, please raise your hand. I could feel the tension rise, the moment of truth upon us. One by one, the hands of the board members began to lift into the air, tentative at first, then with more certainty. Victoria's supporters were few and far between now, their faces etched with the recognition that her time at Montgomery was over. As the last hand raised, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I had been holding. The vote was unanimous. Victoria's face went white as the reality of the situation sank in. She looked from one board member to the next, her mouth opening and closing, as though trying to find the right words to defend herself. But there was nothing left to say. The board had spoken. You can't do this, she finally choked out, her voice breaking. I built this company up from nothing. You're making a mistake. But there was no sympathy in the room, not anymore. I wasn't the only one who had watched her dismantle Montgomery piece by piece. The board members had seen the truth too. Harold stood up, his voice steady. The decision has been made, Victoria. We're terminating your contract effective immediately. You're no longer the CEO of Montgomery Pharmaceuticals. For a moment, Victoria stood there, her body trembling with the weight of defeat. The air in the room seemed to crackle with the power of what had just happened. She had lost, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me as I watched her slowly gather her things, her movements stiff and jerky. I had been waiting for this moment for years, and yet I couldn't bring myself to feel triumphant. No, this wasn't about victory. It was about saving Montgomery, about righting the wrongs that had been done. As Victoria walked past me, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and disbelief, she turned to me one last time. You'll regret this, she spat. You'll see. The market is changing, and Montgomery will be obsolete within 5 years. You can't stop that. I met her gaze, my expression calm but resolute. Maybe we will be obsolete, but we'll do it with our integrity intact. That's something you'll never understand. She paused for a moment, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. You could have learned something from me, Eve. You could have been great. I did learn something from you, Victoria, I said quietly, my voice unwavering. I learned exactly how I don't want to lead. With that, she stormed out of the room, flanked by security, her head held high despite the defeat that was evident in her every step. The boardroom remained silent, as we all absorbed what had just transpired. I turned back to the board, the weight of the moment sinking in. This was only the beginning. The real work had just started. It wasn't enough to remove Victoria. We had to rebuild. We had to restore the values that had made Montgomery great in the first place. Now, I said, looking around the room, my voice firm, it's time to focus on the future of Montgomery Pharmaceuticals. We're going to make sure we never lose sight of what matters most. And with that, I knew we were on the path to something new, something better, and this time, we would do it right. The room remained heavy with silence long after Victoria's departure, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of the decisions that had been made. I stood at the head of the table, facing the board members, but my mind was elsewhere. I had won this battle, yes, but the war to save Montgomery was just beginning. The realization of what had transpired started to sink in. Victoria was gone. The first and most immediate step had been taken. But the company she left behind, what would we do with that? A company built on strong foundations, on integrity and quality, had been dragged through the mud, subjected to decisions made on greed and short-term goals. And now it was my responsibility to restore it. Not just to its former glory, but to a place where it could stand tall again, not by cutting corners, but by focusing on what mattered most: people, values, and quality. I could feel the weight of the room's gaze on me, their expectations hanging in the air like a palpable force. They had seen what had happened with Victoria, but they hadn't yet seen what I was prepared to do next. Harold, the oldest and most experienced member of the board, finally broke the silence. "Eve," he said. His voice calm but filled with the kind of respect I hadn't heard from him in years. "This isn't going to be easy. Victoria's legacy is in the walls of Montgomery now. She's left her mark on the company, for better or worse." I nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in his words. "I know, Harold. But that's exactly why we have to act fast. The longer we wait, the deeper the damage will go." "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Harold continued, a hint of concern in his voice. "It's one thing to take down a CEO, it's another to lead this company back to where it needs to be. People are scared, the employees are nervous, they don't know what comes next." He was right, of course. I had seen the fear in their eyes. When I had walked into the boardroom this morning, the employees in the halls had looked at me with uncertainty. They didn't know who I was now. They didn't know what to expect from me. Would I be like Victoria, cold and calculating? Or would I be the leader they had hoped for, one who cared about their well-being, about restoring the integrity of Montgomery? "I've been with Montgomery for longer than most of you," I said, my voice firm as I looked around the room. "And while I may not have been here as the public face for the past 3 years, I've never stopped caring about this company. I've watched from the inside. I've seen the decisions we've made, the sacrifices, the mistakes. But I've also seen the heart of this company. The employees who pour everything they have into the work we do. They are the reason Montgomery has survived all these years, and they are the ones who will carry us forward, but only if we show them we're serious about." I let the words settle into the room before continuing. "We have to be transparent. No more secrets, no more fear-driven decisions. We have to restore our research division, reinvest in the values my family founded this company on: quality, integrity, and dedication to our mission. We need to give the employees the resources and support they need to do their best work, and we need to let them know that they are valued, not just as employees, but as people who make Montgomery what it is." The board members exchanged glances, some nodding slowly, while others seemed to be considering what I had said. I could see the unease in their expressions, but also a flicker of something else: hope. Hope that perhaps there was still a chance for Montgomery to be more than just a business, that it could still be a place where employees felt valued, where their work mattered. One of the newer members of the board, Elise Chen, the marketing director, spoke up. "You're asking a lot of us, Eve. This isn't going to be a quick fix. The company's brand has been damaged. Our reputation has taken a hit. People are starting to question if we can still do the work we've always done. We need to rebuild, but that takes time and money. Can we afford that right now?" I could feel the weight of her words. The financial state of Montgomery was precarious, and the upcoming merger with Axiom had already put a strain on our resources. But I also knew that if we didn't act quickly to restore the integrity of the company, any chance of survival would be lost. "We can't afford not to do this," I replied, my voice steady. "If we don't restore our reputation, we'll lose everything we've built. The trust of our employees, the loyalty of our customers, the foundation of Montgomery itself. Yes, it will take time, and yes, it will take effort, but we have no choice. We either rebuild or we die. But if we rebuild the right way, with our values intact, we'll come out stronger than ever." There was a long pause as the board members considered my words. The tension in the room had shifted, no longer just a reaction to my confrontation with Victoria, but to the larger question of Montgomery's future. Finally, Harold spoke again. "You're right, Eve. We've spent too long chasing profits at the expense of everything else. It's time we remembered what Montgomery was meant to be. It's time we got back to the core of what made this company great." I smiled, a sense of relief washing over me. It wasn't going to be easy, but I could see that the board was ready to follow. The decisions I was about to make wouldn't just reshape the leadership structure. They would reshape the very culture of Montgomery. "We're not just going to fix what's broken," I said, looking around the room at the people who had once supported Victoria. "We're going to make Montgomery the kind of company it was always meant to be. A place where integrity comes first. A place where people come before profits. And a place where innovation can thrive because we care about our patients, our employees, and our community." The meeting continued, and the discussions that followed were focused on the practical steps we would take to restore Montgomery's operations. We talked about reinvesting in research, bringing back the employees who had been pushed out, and ensuring that the company's leadership structure was aligned with the values we held dear. But as I sat back in my chair, listening to the voices of the board, I felt a renewed sense of hope. This was the beginning of something better. The beginning of a company that would lead with its heart, not just its bottom line. Montgomery wasn't just a pharmaceutical company. It was a legacy, and I was ready to fight for it. The following weeks were a blur of meetings, decisions, and a flurry of activity. What I had started in that boardroom was just the beginning. The work of rebuilding Montgomery Pharmaceuticals wasn't going to happen overnight, and it would require every ounce of focus, dedication, and integrity I had left. But despite the challenges that lay ahead, I felt a renewed sense of purpose that I hadn't experienced in years. This was what I was meant to do: restore Montgomery to its rightful place, not as a company driven by profit alone, but as a place where values still mattered, where people still mattered. The first step in that process was communication. We had to rebuild trust, not just within the boardroom, but within every department, from research and development to the sales floor. The company had been fractured under Victoria's reign, but I knew that if we could bring people back together, if we could show them that we were serious about change, we could begin to heal. I called for a company-wide meeting. The employees had heard the rumors about Victoria's departure, and while they had seen some immediate changes in the leadership structure, there were still questions. They didn't know who I had become in the 3 years I spent undercover. And they certainly didn't know what I planned to do next. This meeting would be my opportunity to show them. The auditorium was packed, the hum of whispered conversations filling the room as people took their seats. I stood at the front, waiting for the noise to die down, my heart pounding in my chest. This was the first time in years I was stepping out from behind the veil of anonymity. I wasn't just Eve Daniels anymore. I was Eve Montgomery, and I had to prove to everyone in that room that I could lead them through this storm. As the chatter died down, I cleared my throat, my voice amplified by the microphone. "Good morning, everyone," I began, my voice calm but firm. "For those of you who don't know me, I'm Eve Montgomery. Some of you knew me as Eve Daniels, a member of the analytics department. I've worked here for a long time, and today I'm here to address what's been happening at Montgomery Pharmaceuticals." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle in. The room was still, everyone hanging on to every syllable. I could feel the eyes of my colleagues on me, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, uncertainty, and perhaps even a little fear. They had seen what happened under Victoria's leadership, and now they were looking to me for answers. "I know many of you are uncertain about what's next," I continued. "I know that the changes we've undergone, the layoffs, the reorganization, the push for a merger, everything has left us fractured. But I'm here today to tell you that this is not the future of Montgomery Pharmaceuticals. We're not going to continue down the path of fear and shortcuts. We're going to rebuild, together." I could see a glimmer of hope in their eyes, a spark of recognition that perhaps things could be different. But I also saw skepticism. Change was difficult, and trust was something that had to be earned. "I want to make something very clear," I said, my voice steady as I looked out at the crowd. "Montgomery is about more than just business, it's about people. people who trust us to create medications that improve lives. It's about our legacy, the values my grandfather instilled in this company when he started it in his garage. And it's about you, the people who make Montgomery what it is. Without you, there is no Montgomery. The room was silent for a moment, and then I could hear the soft murmur of agreement. The employees were starting to feel the shift. They were starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, Montgomery could return to the company they had once believed in. I know some of you have already left. Some of you were forced to leave. But I want you to know that if you're still here, you matter. And if you're not, we'll do everything we can to bring you back. We will reinvest in research, in quality, in people. And we will rebuild the Montgomery that you've always been proud to work for. I will make sure of that. There was a ripple of applause, hesitant at first but growing louder as I spoke. It wasn't a victory cheer. It was the beginning of something. The beginning of a collective commitment to restore Montgomery Pharmaceuticals to its roots. The days that followed were filled with meetings, some with the board, others with department heads, as we mapped out our plan to restore Montgomery to a company that valued its people, its mission, and its legacy. We committed to reinvesting in the research division, bringing back the experienced scientists who had been let go under Victoria's leadership. We streamlined our processes without sacrificing quality, ensuring that each product that left our facility was one we could be proud of. And perhaps most importantly, we made sure that employees had a voice, a way to express their concerns and ideas without fear of retaliation. The hardest part, though, was earning back the trust of the employees. Many of them had been burned by Victoria's leadership, and they weren't going to just take my word for it. I had to show them. I had to prove that I was different, that I was there for them, and that I wasn't going to abandon the company the way Victoria had. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks. There were moments of doubt. There were days when it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on me. But every time I felt myself falter, I thought about my father, my grandfather. I thought about the legacy we had built, the patients who relied on our medications, the employees who had given so much to make Montgomery what it was. I couldn't let that slip away. Not on my watch. As weeks turned into months, the atmosphere in the company began to change. Slowly but surely, people began to feel like they could trust again. The fear that had once permeated the halls of Montgomery was replaced by a sense of hope. Employees felt empowered to speak up, to contribute ideas, to be a part of something bigger than themselves. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And then one afternoon, as I walked through the research division, I overheard a conversation between two scientists. "You know," one said, "I think this might actually work. I think Montgomery might be back." A small smile tugged at my lips as I continued down the hall. There was still so much work to be done, but for the first time in years, I felt like we were on the right path. The future of Montgomery Pharmaceuticals was no longer uncertain. It was bright, and together, we were going to ensure that it stayed that way. The weeks that followed Victoria's removal marked the beginning of a profound transformation at Montgomery Pharmaceuticals. We had started rebuilding, but what we were creating wasn't just a reorganization of departments or a restoration of profits. It was the reawakening of a vision. The vision that my grandfather had built this company on and that my father had championed. A vision that prioritized quality, integrity, and the well-being of our patients above all else. It was a delicate process. Rebuilding trust didn't happen overnight. There were days when doubt crept in, when I wondered if the changes we were making were enough, or if I was moving too quickly. But with each passing day, I saw the results of our efforts. Employees were more engaged, the quality of our research and products was improving, and even our public reputation started to shift. The Montgomery name, which had once been associated with fear and toxic leadership, was beginning to stand for something else. Something positive, something hopeful. I had made the decision early on that transparency would be at the heart of everything we did. It was important for our employees to know the truth about the challenges we were facing and how we planned to overcome them. I made it a priority to hold regular town halls where anyone could ask questions, voice concerns, or suggest improvements. I knew that only by including them in the process could we create the kind of culture that would carry Montgomery forward. One of the first things we did was reinstate the research division, but we didn't just throw money at it and hope it worked. We carefully selected the right people to lead the charge, people who understood the value of rigorous science and patient safety. Many of the scientists who had been let go under Victoria's leadership returned, and we were able to restore their trust. It was more than just rehiring. It was about rebuilding relationships and creating an environment where they felt valued, respected, and supported. The results were immediate. Research teams once fragmented were now collaborating again. The productivity levels we had seen before Victoria took over returned, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Every breakthrough, every new discovery, felt like a victory, not just for Montgomery, but for the patients we served. The marketing team, under the leadership of Elise, worked tirelessly to rehabilitate our public image. We launched new campaigns that focused on the real story of Montgomery, our history, our values, our commitment to patient care. We told the truth, and the truth resonated. It wasn't about glossy advertisements or hollow promises, it was about showing the world that Montgomery was a company with integrity. And as we began to grow again, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The board, which had once been so divided, now worked together in harmony. We brought in new members, people who shared our vision, who understood the importance of ethical leadership, people who were willing to make the tough decisions that would benefit Montgomery in the long term, even if they weren't the easiest or the most profitable in the short term. One afternoon, months after that initial company-wide meeting, I found myself walking through the halls of Montgomery Pharmaceuticals once more. This time, the atmosphere was different. There was a buzz in the air, but it wasn't the fear of before. It was energy, optimism. People were talking, collaborating, laughing. There was a lightness to the space, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. I paused outside a conference room where a team of researchers was gathered around a table, discussing a new project. They looked up as I passed, and for the first time in a long while, I felt their genuine warmth. Their smiles weren't forced. They weren't doing it out of obligation, they were doing it because they believed in what we were building. The vision we were creating was something they could rally behind, and that was the moment I realized that Montgomery wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. We had weathered the storm, and we had come out stronger. The lessons we had learned, the mistakes we had made, and the people who had helped us along the way had all played a part in making Montgomery a company that could stand the test of time. As I entered my office, I looked out the window at the Chicago skyline. It was the same view I had looked at for years, but it felt different now. The future felt full of promise. There was still work to be done, of course, challenges to overcome, goals to meet, but I had never felt more certain that we were on the right path. I sat at my desk and opened the drawer where I kept a picture of my father, the one that had been taken during a company picnic. I had placed it there not long after I had taken control. It was a reminder of who I was doing this for, not just for the company, but for the people who had built it. And as I gazed at the photo, I realized that it wasn't just his legacy I was preserving. It was the legacy of every employee who had worked at Montgomery, from the scientist to the maintenance crew, from the executives to the newest hires. It was a shared legacy, built on trust, hard work, and a commitment to something greater than ourselves. The phone on my desk buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. It was Alan, my old confidant. I answered with a smile, knowing the conversation would be one of congratulations. "Congratulations, Eve," he said warmly. "Your father would be proud." I smiled back, though it wasn't about pride. "I hope so," I said softly. "But we're not done yet, we've got more work to do." The conversation drifted into practical matters, but my mind wandered again, back to the first day I had ever set foot in Montgomery Pharmaceuticals as Eve Daniels. Back then, everything had felt uncertain, like a game I was playing to expose the truth. But now, everything had changed. The truth was no longer something to expose. It was something we would live by every day. Montgomery Pharmaceuticals wasn't just a company. It was a promise to our employees, to our patients, and to the legacy of my family. And as I hung up the phone and returned my gaze to the window, I knew that the work we were doing would last far longer than any short-term success or failure. It was a legacy worth fighting for, and we were just getting started.